Factories weren't just closing in the US, they were shutting down across the border too. Ports sat eerily quiet. Warehouses stacked with aluminum and steel turned into graveyards of unsold goods. America's tariffs weren't just targeting trade, they were squeezing the life out of Canada's economy. So how did Canada avoid full-blown collapse? Here's the twist. It wasn't the US that came to the rescue. 10 unexpected countries stepped in when Canada was at its most vulnerable. Some became new buyers, others opened their doors just wide enough. The question is, how many of these quiet allies do you even know about? Number 10. Germany. Canadian pharmaceutical exports were tanking US biotech firms. Once steady customers pulled back in supply chains for active pharmaceutical ingredients. API started falling apart. Canada wasn't just losing money, it was watching a billion-dollar sector unravel one shipment at a time. Now here's where it gets shocking. Germany quietly stepped in and helped stabilize it all. Yes, while headlines focused on steel, oil and auto parts, the real lifeline came through something far more precise: pharmaceutical chemicals. As American buyers turned their backs during the tariff war, Germany opened its doors wider. In just 1 year, Canadian AP exports to Germany jumped nearly 20% from $420 million to $500 million. That's a massive deal when thousands of lab workers, chemical engineers and logistics crews depend on this flow to survive. Why Germany? Because as one of the world's pharmaceutical powerhouses, they needed reliable, tariff-free sources, and under CEA, Canada was ready to deliver. That single trade agreement, once dismissed as minor, suddenly became a cornerstone of Canada's survival strategy. Now ask yourself, how many people would have predicted Germany of all countries would be the reason 100 of Canadian pharmaceutical plants stayed open? This wasn't just about chemistry, it was about timing, diplomacy, and the ability to adapt when the closest ally turns hostile. Germany didn't just buy chemicals, they bought time for Canadian industry to regroup. They gave hope to a sector on the verge of collapse, and without them Canada could have faced mass layoffs in science hubs like Toronto, Vancouver and Montreal. Research would have dried up, innovation would have stalled, and the jobs gone. Possibly for good. Number 9. United Kingdom. Steel mills were going idle, gold refiners in Quebec were laying off workers, and cross-border exports slashed nearly overnight. Canada's economy was bleeding from a 1,000 tariff cuts, mostly thanks to America's sudden trade war. So how did the UK of all places help keep Canada's head above water? Here's where things get wild. After US tariffs kicked in, Canadian gold exports to the United Kingdom exploded by nearly 500%. That's not a typo. British refiners became an emergency lifeline, snapping up raw Canadian gold that once went south. But why gold? Because when trade routes break down, investors panic and gold becomes king. London needed it. Canada had it boom, an unlikely alliance formed almost overnight. This single shift helped save thousands of mining jobs and injected fresh cash into Canada's financial veins. So when people ask who helped Canada during the tariff war, would you have guessed? Britain made the list. Number 8. Japan. Canadian auto parts were stacking up in warehouses. US automakers, under pressure from tariffs and political heat, began scaling back imports. Ontario's manufacturing belt, once Canada's industrial pride, was facing layoffs, factory shutdowns, and growing panic. What do you do when your biggest customer suddenly walks away? Shockingly, Japan answered the call. Yes. while everyone expected Canada's auto sector to crumble under US tariffs. Japan stepped in as a buyer. Fast thanks to the CPTPP trade deal, tariffs between Canada and Japan dropped to zero, creating a backdoor escape for Canadian manufacturers. Within a single year, exports of Canadian auto parts to Japan surged 22%, jumping from $1.8 billion to $2.2 billion. That's not just recovery. It's redirection. Japanese automakers like Toyota and Honda were eager to source parts from a stable, tariff-free partner in Canada. Canada was desperate to keep its assembly lines alive. Here's the wild part. These weren't just tiny orders. They kept entire plants running, machinists stayed employed, logistics companies avoided collapse. Cities like Osha and Windsor were able to hold the line, all because Japan helped pick up the slack when America left Canada in the dust. Now think about this, what would have happened if Japan hadn't moved so quickly? Thousands more jobs gone, entire communities hollowed out. That's the reality Canada was facing. It's easy to overlook how fragile global supply chains really are until one piece breaks. Japan's move wasn't just smart economics. It was a lifeline, a strategic pivot that helped Canada dodge a far bigger crisis. So the next time someone says Canada stood alone during the tariff war, ask them if they know what Japan did behind the scenes before we show you the next unlikely country that saved Canada from the brink. Don't forget to subscribe so we can keep bringing you the stories. No one else is telling you're not going to believe who's coming up next. Number 7. South Korea. Battery factories were shutting down plans. Nickel suppliers had nowhere to send shipments, and Canadian aluminum it was being stockpiled like scrap, unwanted, and used and unshipped. US tariffs didn't just hurt exports, they nearly crushed Canada's future in the global energy race. But then something completely unexpected happened. South Korea stepped in not just as a buyer but as a strategic partner, and what they did next changed everything. Here's the part most people don't realize. South Korea's demand for critical minerals nickel, cobalt, and aluminum was skyrocketing because of its EV boom. The country needed reliable sources fast. Canada had the metals, but the US had slammed the door shut. Thanks to the Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement, South Korea became one of Canada's most important mineral buyers, purchasing over $1.2 billion worth of aluminum alone by 2024. That's not just impressive. It was essential because without those exports, Canada's mining towns, smelters, and refining plants would have had no reason to keep running, and it didn't stop there. South Korea's tech giant Samsung LG, SK Innovation began investing in Ontario-based gigafactories, pouring money into Canada's EV supply chain just when the country needed it most. These partnerships brought in billions of dollars, created thousands of jobs, and ensured that Canada stayed in the game as a global clean energy competitor. Now here's a question: what would have happened if South Korea hadn't made that move? Picture mines closing in Sudbury, picture layoffs in Quebec's aluminum belt, picture Canada being completely shut out of the EV revolution. It didn't happen because South Korea said yes when others said nothing. This wasn't just a trade shift. It was a geopolitical rescue mission, and Canada was lucky to be on the receiving end before we get to the next surprising country that helped pull Canada back from the edge. Do us a favor, subscribe to the channel so we can keep giving you stories that actually matter, because who comes next? Almost no one saw that one coming. Number 6. Netherlands. Oil shipments were getting rerouted. Refineries in the US suddenly slammed the door shut, and Alberta's pipelines backed up like a traffic jam with no exit ramp. Canada's energy sector was in chaos and the clock was ticking, so how did the Netherlands swoop in and make a difference? Rotterdam, Europe's busiest port, became an unlikely savior. In just 1 year, Canadian crude exports to the Netherlands jumped by nearly 30%, hitting over $900 million. That's not just a trade stat. It was a lifeline. Dutch refineries picked up the slack left by the US, keeping Canadian producers running and paychecks rolling in across the prairies. Here's the real question. What would have happened if the Netherlands didn't step in? How close did Canada come to a full-blown energy crisis? Before we continue, hit that subscribe button. If you want more eye-opening stories like this, because the countries that saved Canada next might surprise you even more. Number 5. India. Steel mills were scaling back, metal exports were being rejected, and Canadian infrastructure suppliers struggling to stay afloat with the US market locking Canada out through sudden tariffs. The country's iron and aluminum industries were staring down the barrel of disaster. Then something unexpected happened. India quietly stepped into the picture. At first glance, India might not seem like a major player in Canada's economic survival. But here's what most people don't realize. India was in the middle of a massive infrastructure explosion. Bullet trains, metro rail projects, highways, solar grids. India needed materials, lots of them. That's when Canadian exporters made their move. And by 2024, India had absorbed $28 million worth of Canadian steel and $18 million in aluminum, a 10% jump from the previous year. Now those numbers might sound modest, but they meant everything for mid-tier Canadian producers who were about to fold. This wasn't about massive mega deals. It was about thousands of small shipments, quiet transactions that kept jobs alive in places no one was watching. Think about it. What if India hadn't needed those materials? Where would all that excess steel have gone? Landfills, liquidation, or worse? Would companies have started cutting labor just to stay afloat? And there's more. India's interest didn't stop at metal. As trade ties expanded, so did opportunities in pharmaceuticals, clean energy parts, and agriculture. Canadian firms found themselves entering India's supply chain at just the right moment when the country's population and consumption were exploding. India didn't just ease the pressure. It created new opportunities, new markets that didn't rely on US approval or US tariffs. In short, India helped Canada get off its knees. So next time someone says Canada stood alone, ask them this. Did you know India helped keep our steel mills open? Before we move into the top 2 countries that helped Canada during its hardest economic moment, be sure to hit that subscribe button, so you don't miss what comes next, because it's only getting crazier from here. Number 4. Mexico. Steel was piling up in ports, aluminum sat untouched in rail yards and Canadian factories. They were scaling back production. Fast US tariffs had slammed the door on Canada's metals, one of its most vital exports. The fear that the ripple effect would wipe out entire cities built around steel. But guess who stepped up? Not Europe, not Asia. Mexico. While most were focused on Canada's fight with the US, Mexico quietly became a trade lifeline. By 2024, Mexico was Canada's second largest non-US buyer of steel and aluminum, importing $520 million in steel and $328 million in aluminum. Let that sink in. Why does this matter? Because these weren't luxury goods. These were the building blocks of an entire economy, raw materials that support construction, manufacturing, even defense. If those metals didn't move, jobs would have vanished across the prairies and Ontario. Here's the kicker. Mexico didn't just buy it, replaced the US in key parts of the supply chain. Through USCA's rules of origin, Canadian metal could still legally flow into North America via Mexico. It was like opening a back door in a house that America had locked from the front. So ask yourself this. What if Mexico hadn't stepped in? How many Canadian companies would have collapsed under the weight of unsold inventory? How many families would have seen their income vanish with no warning? And it goes deeper. Mexico didn't just save Canada's exports, it kept North American manufacturing on life support. A working supply chain between Canada and Mexico meant thousands of products still reached assembly lines in both countries. That's what kept the lights on. For many, it's one of the least talked about partnerships, but also one of the most important. Number 3. Australia. Investment was drying up, smaller mining firms in Canada couldn't get funding, and rare earth projects critical to the clean energy transition put on pause. As US tariffs crippled trade and uncertainty scared off capital, Canada's resource economy looked dangerously exposed. But then came an unexpected ally from the other side of the world, Australia. While most eyes were on Europe or Asia, Australia quietly became a financial and trade lifeline. Not only did they increase purchases of Canadian steel and aluminum up 12% in 2024 alone, hitting over $62 million, they also pumped in fresh capital to keep Canada's mining sector alive. Why would Australia, a resource-rich nation itself, come to Canada's aid? Because Australia saw the bigger picture. They understood that a stable North American supply of critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, rare earths benefited them too. It reduced China's grip on global production and ensured reliable materials for shared defense and tech partnerships. Suddenly, Australian investors were teaming up with Canadian firms to open new mines, share refining tech, and even collaborate on battery research. These weren't charity deals, they were survival alliances, and Canada needed them badly. Now, here's what makes it shocking. Without this support, dozens of small Canadian mines might have collapsed. Entire regions, especially in northern Ontario and Quebec, would have faced shutdowns. Jobs gone, communities wiped off the economic map. So ask yourself, what would have happened if Australia had sat this one out? Could Canada have made it through the US tariff war without losing a massive chunk of its resource economy? Probably not. Australia didn't just buy a few shipments. They helped Canada hold the line when it mattered most, and they did it without making headlines. Number 2. Malaysia. Canadian aluminum producers were in crisis, shipments meant for the US were getting rejected, warehouses were overflowing, entire shipping lanes went dark for months. It felt like one of Canada's biggest exports had nowhere to go and no one was coming to help. Then quietly, Malaysia opened its ports. Not many people talk about this, but between 2023 and 2025, Malaysia increased its imports of Canadian aluminum by 15%, hitting $62 million, a massive jump for a country many Canadians couldn't even find on a map. But for aluminum producers in Quebec and British Columbia, it was nothing short of a lifeline. Why Malaysia and why now? Because Southeast Asia's electronics and aerospace industries were booming. Factories in Penang and Kuala Lumpur needed high-grade aluminum for components and fast. With American tariffs pricing US metals out of reach, Canada became the perfect alternative. Malaysian companies seized the moment, opening a new route for Canada's stranded metal. Here's what makes this even more shocking. This trade lane didn't even exist at this scale before it was created. After the US shut its doors, Malaysia didn't just take in leftovers. They gave Canadian exporters a brand new corridor into the Asian market. And that's not all. The aluminum boom also pulled in Canadian shipping firms, logistics operators, and port workers. What looked like a minor trade relationship ended up saving 100 of jobs across multiple provinces. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it worked. Now think about this. What if Malaysia hadn't opened its doors? Canada's aluminum industry may have lost over $200 million in potential revenue. Layoffs would have spread like wildfire through eastern Quebec. Smaller producers might have folded completely. Instead, Malaysia stepped in and helped Canada breathe again. Number 1, Thailand. Export markets were collapsing, farmers couldn't move their goods, agri-tech startups were losing contracts, while all eyes were on steel, oil and manufacturing. One sector was quietly suffocating Canada's agriculture and agri-tech industry. And here's the twist, no one saw coming. Thailand became the number 1 unexpected savior. That's right. When American buyers pulled back and traditional Asian markets hesitated, Thailand suddenly stepped up with targeted trade deals and support from Canada's Export Development Corporation (EDC). Thailand's imports of Canadian agri-food products jumped 23%, passing $230 million in 2024. But that wasn't the shocking part. Thailand didn't just buy beef grains and produce. They signed biopotential, pesticide, and clean agriculture tech deals like a $12 million contract with Vancouver-based firm Terramea. In other words, they helped launch an entirely new lifeline for Canadian agritech at a moment when the US was shutting its doors. Why would Thailand do this? Because they were facing food insecurity, climate instability, and tech gaps in their own agricultural system. Canada had the solutions, Thailand had the demand, the result a win-win that no one was predicting. And this trade boost didn't just help exporters, it kept Canadian farmers in business, helped innovators stay funded and protected regional economies in places like Saskatchewan, Alberta and rural Ontario. Now, here's the question. No one's asking what if Thailand hadn't opened up. Without those agritech contracts and product exports, Canada's farming communities would have been hit with a second blow right after the tariffs cut them off from the US. Entire towns would have faced closures, agri-tech innovation would have stalled, and young workers entering the industry gone elsewhere. But Thailand's demand kept the sector moving and gave Canada a new economic pillar to lean on. So there you have it, 10 unexpected countries that helped keep Canada standing when it was close to collapse. If this surprised you, imagine what else the headlines aren't telling. Like, share and hit that subscribe button, so you never miss the stories that actually matter. We've got more coming.